Yes, good. So my name is Andreas. I have been working with Spotify for about 5 years in the capacity of a product manager. Spotify nowadays have 130 million subscribers, so that is paying subscribers, and there are 286 million active users on the platform per month. We have nowadays about 15 million tracks, and we are present on 79 markets currently. We are not in Africa and large parts of Asia, you can say, but otherwise we are in the whole world. Yeah, so I have been asked to talk about data, and I will talk about data and how we create value of it from a product management perspective. Then you can say we have a lot of data scientists, etc., at the company and researchers. But you can say Spotify has to start with a pretty restrictive view on how we use data for our own purposes. So we are, of course, as all other companies, are obeying to the GDPR directive. But we are actually applying the GDPR directive for the whole world, not only Europe and European countries. And that is because it's easier for us to not, you can say, separate different countries between each other. Spotify is, most of you have probably tried Spotify in some case on a mobile phone. Spotify has been around for about 12 years. It's implemented on more than 200 platforms today, actually. So it is on everything from computers, smart speakers, smart watches, game consoles, wearables, etc. So there is quite a few implementations of the Spotify client. The Spotify customer base we divide them into two different segments or categories, you can say. We have the paid and we have the non-paid. The paid service is then a music service, which is on demand. You can offline content, etc. And the free service, there you don't have complete on demand, so you can't play exactly the song you want at all times. And it is ad-based. And it's a bit important for us when we create products that we know that that we have these two kinds of segments that we have to work with. Yeah, of course, we, as all other companies today that run subscription services, collect data from our customers. That data is, of course, you can say usage data. It is data related to payments. When you listen to a specific song, we record that you listen to that specific song, what kind of device you were using, what time it is, and so on. Part of that data collection is actually about that we have to do it to compensate labels, artists, etc. And then parts of it is about payment information and so on. And then you can say it is about improving the service and the user's experience. So you can say when it comes to things like music recommendations, personal playlist, etc., that is of course something that really needs this data. Now, as you saw on the slide before, Spotify is a pretty large company, so nowadays, and when you have 280 million active users, that is quite a lot of data. And then you have to really start selecting what data that you record, etc., because otherwise you will be in trouble. When we develop product, we of course use this data. And if we change a service or we change something in the Spotify client, we of course need to, you can say, have a clue about what is better. So when we make a change, should we actually roll that change out to everybody, or how should we treat this? And here it really comes in that Spotify is very, very data driven. So you can say that if I make a change to the Spotify client, I can of course send out a survey to ask people what they think about this change. We can look into if the retention increases, how long they stay at the service. That's of course is something that has a quite huge delay. Or we can look into how much they use the service and see if that is changing. So we often look at, you can say, average minutes of use per day per user, for example, or we look out at daily active users and monthly active users. We often use an acronym, or you can say we call it engagement, and the engagement is then you can think of that if a month has 30 days, we see how many of those days you are active in, and then we can calculate in a percentage number your engagement level. So if you're active in 20 days in a month, out of 30, you have a 66% engagement level. That is when we're creating the services, new services, and making changes, probably one of the most important KPIs that we are using. There is a lot of other underlying KPIs about behaviors, etc., that are important, but you can say the engagement level is strictly connected to retention and how long people are actually staying at our service. And there is a lot of, you can say, we have looked into this and correlated it to a lot of user behaviors. This is the parameter that we're using the most. And we probably share this with a lot of other companies. So what do? When we want to, somebody comes up with an idea of how to improve our service in some way. And you can say, I will take a non-real example here on this. So if somebody thinks that if we reverse the colors in the client, we will have, it will be easier to read and therefore we'll have increased listening. And you can say Spotify is divided in quite a few squads or groups, and they all have their different responsibilities, and they all can actually come up with ideas on improvements. That improvement, or you can say this hypothesis, is then weighted and discussed, and we compare it with others, and then we implement the one that we believe the most in. Very often we roll that change out to a certain amount of users, and we have a control group which we then comparing then different usage patterns with. And again, the engagement level and the amount of listening is often the steering one here. So when we see if something gives a positive effect, we roll it out to a wider audience and then to the whole audience. If you have been using Spotify, you probably see that Spotify on iPhone and on Android are often updated weekly. And you can say that there is changes in it constantly on different places, etc. From time to time, it is hard for you to see what has changed. From time to time, you see small difference, etc., that you notice. From time to time, there is, of course, a big change. We evaluate these changes by doing these A/B tests, and then you can say if it is successful, we roll it out. Now you can say this is an idealized description, of course, because this is, you can say there's quite a few groups that we have overarching goals of what we want to achieve, etc. And the different groups have different areas that they are responsible to, and so on. But mainly the point with this is that we are searching for patterns. We are, you can say, building hypotheses on how we can improve things. We are implementing it, and we're testing it in A/B tests very, very often. The challenges with working in this way is, of course, as I said, that the organization is distributed. There are very many squads with their own responsibilities. There you can say that an increased consumption or increased active days per month is good, but it won't actually explain why the user increased the change. Sure, you can say that you have the idea that you did something or you did a change and therefore it was that triggered the change in the user behavior. And that is of course true, but it doesn't mean that you actually know the user and understand why the user changed their behavior. It is also important to understand the user's context. For example, mobile data in Sweden is very, very cheap. Mobile data in Brazil is quite expensive. So the different behaviors in Sweden and Brazil is staggering. In Sweden, you can say that very few people are offline in content. You continue to listen when you leave your home. In Brazil, you are offline in content if you're paying for the service. We see that very few people are listening to the service outside their home because of data costs. This is nothing that you can see directly in the data. You can see the behavior in the data, but you can't understand it. Therefore, the data in itself is not always the answer. It shows the effect of something. You can say we have instrumented the app quite good, which means that we're logging quite a lot of different things that you do in the app. We can very often see that you have pressed on a certain field in the app and that you have taken a certain path to end up at somewhere. We see what you consume, etc. Then from time to time, a lot of groups want to instrument even more and log a lot more, but that would increase data consumption. It might be a problem with what we are actually storing, etc. Therefore, you can say this is a compromise between a lot of different interests, what we actually can instrument, etc. And there is a limitation here that you have to keep track of in some way. A perspective what you log, and this is an old joke in some way that is quite funny, and this is about how detailed you go into something. A mathematician, a physicist, and an engineer are riding a train through Scotland. The engineer looks out the window, sees a black sheep, and exclaims, "Hey, they got black sheep in Scotland." The physicist looks out the window and corrects the engineer. "Strictly speaking, all we know is that there is at least one black sheep in Scotland." The mathematician looks out the window and corrects the physicist. "Strictly speaking, all we know is that there is at least one side of one sheep that is black in Scotland." So, what do I mean with this? What I mean here is that it's very important to say that from time to time, you really need to go into details and specify stuff and really understand something, how it works, people's intentions, etc. But from time to time, you probably have to avoid this and see the big picture instead. Because if you go too deep somewhere, you're probably missing the important large stuff and vice versa. This is, of course, a judgment call, and it's you can say it's very hard sometimes to do this in the right way or find the right level. I will take a real world example also on what we do, and this is more related to creating new products and what we can do. And you can say the attitude towards data and attitudes towards what you can learn and what you have to complement with from knowledge outside. So this is an Edison research paper called Sharrow Ear that was published, as you see down there to the left, at Q2 2017. It more or less says that cars or music streaming or music listening in cars represents more than 40% of all audio listening. I read this paper, and we have a few people working with cars in Spotify. And I thought this was quite interesting because you can say Spotify had that some way say that home is the most important place. And then you can say commuting, traveling is probably the second place, and then you have work, but haven't specified car in this specific way. And if you look at the right-hand side, this is US only. As you see that 70% of the in-car listening is over AM, FM radio. And this was 3 years ago in the US, and you can say, I believe that that has changed a bit, but not very much, but a bit. Then you have owned music. Owned music, that is then memory card, CDs, whatever you have in the car that you are playing from, physical media, more or less. Sirius XM, that is a satellite-based service. So that is more or less, that is radio over satellite, and it's paid radio. It's quite expensive. You pay about $15. All the streaming services, this is Spotify, it is Apple, it is Amazon. All streaming service was actually sharing at 3% of the car consumption during 2007 or during 2016 then. So this is actually an eye-opener in some way, that this research paper here more or less says that we are missing out on a target audience that is 42% in some way. So then you can use some, you can Google a bit, of course, and look into this. And here you can say that, yeah, the population in the US is 325 million. There are 270 million cars. And the labor force in the US is 140 million. And there are actually 123 million daily commuters by car. And you have 100 million with cars built after 2010. And then you can say that 90 million of all these are probably listening to music at some time during this. Then you can say, we try to dig quite much deeper into this, because this says a bit, but it's hard to correlate this amount of listening to this. And we really wanted to try to understand how many people are actually listening, how long is the commute, are they listening at the beginning or the end of the commute, and what are they listening to and why are they not, you can say, using Spotify more than they are. So we turned into, you can say, what we did to start with was that we tried to understand, can we understand how much of the listening that comes from a phone in the car? And it turned out that yes, we can, partially, because when you're using the phone in the car, you're either connecting the phone by Bluetooth or you're using an aux cable. The aux cable is, of course, invisible for us. We can't detect when somebody put in an aux cable in the phone and using it. But we can see when you're pairing your phone and when the phone is active and you're using Bluetooth or A2DP from the Spotify client into the car by the Bluetooth host names. So we can do a few clever things and understand that now someone has connected the phone to a car. By pulling that data and adding quite a lot of work to refining that, we could in some way, by quite high, you can say more than 95% accuracy, say that you are streaming music in a car by Bluetooth. Then you can say, when we have that knowledge, we can do the really advanced stuff. And that is, by using that data, we can learn by machine learning, we can understand what behavior somebody that are using that in a car has. So we can in some way try to understand how many that are in a car that are using aux. And by that way, we can in some way actually pull out this data and see how much of the usage in the US is in a car. Here you see inside, so this is more or less than the iPhone there to the left is obviously a superset of some of the other categories here, so don't look at that too much. But here you see again that this was Spotify's view at some point of time when it comes to how important is car right now for us in consumption. Another perspective of this is, of course, that you can say you don't know everything about everybody else by the data you possess yourself. So here is the green curve here, that is the demography in US actually of and it's a bit of a simulation of the Spotify user base. The pink or pink red there, that is Sirius XM's demography. Sirius XM is then, you can say, that is 15% of the usage in cars. And the interesting thing is, of course, here to see that Sirius XM, again, that is a paid radio satellite service. Here you can see that we obviously have inverse target audiences in some way, of course. Now, you can say, you remember that on 2 slides earlier, one of the numbers was how many people that had a car that was newer than 2010. And that is kind of an important figure, because you can say that 2010, that was the year when Bluetooth got common in cars. So you can, if you just want to take one number, you can say that cars before 2010, if we just make this black and white, doesn't have Bluetooth, and cars newer than 2010 have Bluetooth. Then you can, by doing a few assumptions, you can say, if you look at the demography here of the Spotify user base, how many users or how many people in the US that are the age 25 and lower do you think buy a new BMW or something like that in the US? Pretty few. So you can say our demography probably have more often than others cars that doesn't have Bluetooth. So we have the problem in some way that you probably can't connect the phones because you have bought a second-hand car that is 10 years old. Then you can think in your own bubble in some way that who has a car that is 10 years old? Okay, good question. The average age of a car in Europe is actually 9 years, and the average age of the car in US is 10.5. So half population have a car that is older than 10 years. Now you can say, with all of that data that I now presented here, there are something that is always very, very important. That is, of course, to illustrate the opportunity size of something. And you now got the 3 slides, which is more or less showing that, hey, it's a big opportunity. Spotify is not performing in the car as we should. And the question is then, how do we present that in a good way that is relatable for people working at Spotify? And then you can say, you can do it like this. The blue field here is this is the open data that we have there from the outside. That is car listeners per month in the US. That is directly from this report, more or less. Then you have the axis below, the horizontal axis. There you have, in the blue, you have the monthly music listening in car or average minutes per driver in the US. So the blue field then, that is the total music that is consumed in cars over a month. The green, we of course, as I explained earlier, we actually know when you are consuming music in the car. So the green was what we had at that moment. So the key here is to relate the data that we have in our own pond in some way to macro data, so you can understand this. And if you can say that this more or less show that we have a very, now you can say that the report that I presented earlier, which said that all streaming services were 3%, comes from 2016. And the figure you have in front of you here is later, so therefore they are very different. But the point here is showing that the opportunity for growing here is very, very big. Even though you can in some way, if you look at Spotify in Sweden or in Norway, for example, you can think that it's a saturated market. We already have a huge part of the market space, and it's hard to grow more, etc. And you can say, yeah, in some way it's true, but as I show here, there are areas where you and others don't use Spotify for quite a few different reasons. And there is, you can say, a lot of things that we can do to improve that. What I have tried to show here in the later slides, that is more or less that data is important. And it's important to collect data about your customers, understand consumption patterns, understand how you can improve the services, etc. But it gets really, really powerful when you can correlate that data to external sources and actually combine your own view of your customers to their behaviors outside your own platform. Because that is what is in some way enabling you to draw conclusions like this. That was everything that I had for today. Thank you.